Everyone, welcome to the first panel of Howard Days. We're talking about Spear and Fang and Robert Howard's other early fiction, professional fiction. I'd like to start off with a quote from one of Howard's letters. This is to H.P. Lovecraft, circa July 1933. I was 18 when I wrote Spear and Fang, The Lost Race, The Hyena, 19 when I wrote In the Forests of Belfair and Wolf's Head. And after that, it was 2 solid years before I sold another line of fiction. And we always look at that first period when he was moving from writing for little college journals and just to his friends to making that leap into professionaldom. And it was a hard leap. You know, he had no name recognition. He was very green as a writer. He had talent, but he had to develop his skills. And Spear and Fang wasn't even the first story that he submitted to Weird Tales. Before he submitted Spear and Fang, he submitted The Mystery of Somerton Castle and The Phantom of Old Egypt, which are now lost. We've never read those. But you have to, if you look at the very earliest issues of Weird Tales, those are 2 story titles that make sense, because Weird Tales was not as we've come to know it in those first couple of years under Edward Bear. There was a lot of Egyptian stuff. There was a lot of ghost story stuff. There was a lot of haunted mansion stuff. And there was caveman fiction. The very first issue had Nimba the Cave Girl by R.T.M. Scott. And you see that mode of caveman fiction throughout the pulp era. It's actually pre-pulp. Starts with H.G. Wells with Stories of the Stone Age in 1897. And it continues on with Edgar Rice Burroughs had The Cave Girl in 1913.
There's Jack London's Before Adam is 1903, I think. H. Rider Haggard had Hugh Hugh. That was a little later, like early 20s, right before this period. Yeah, Burroughs had Cave Girl. You had Lost World by Arthur Conan Doyle. You know, where you get not just cavemen but ape men, right? You know, that the kind of missing link fiction too, and it was hugely popular. There was one writer who's pretty obscure, but Rusty Burke is the one who found you sort of found him out that we know Howard almost certainly had read some of the stories, and that was a man named Paul Anderson who wrote some caveman stories for Argosy in 1921, I believe, and 21, 22, is that right, Rusty? Yeah. And you will see that come up later. He wrote about people called the Ta'an, right? These Cro-Magnon folks.
Which very much leads into the early, what was going to be the Cull stories. But that wasn't...
We'll talk about that later.
We'll talk about that later. But what happened was Robert Howard was getting in those early issues of Weird Tales. He was reading them. He was trying to write stories that would fit. And Farnsworth Wright, the new editor, after Edward Baird left, put out a call for a certain type of story. You've got a copy.
You got a copy right there, right?
It's a facsimile of the issue that he would have read. And when Howard picked it up, there was With Weapons of Stone, A Tale of the Cavemen by C.M. Eddy Jr. So they were already appearing a lot of caveman tales and Weird Tales. So what they're referring to was Farnsworth Wright was talking about, we get a lot of these type of caveman stories. We get plenty of manuscripts dealing with fights between dinosaurs and pterodactyls on the one hand and cavemen on the other. But we send them all back because these strange creatures had disappeared from the earth before the first great anthropoid apes rose to the stature of manhood. According to the records of the rocks as read by the geologist, but Neanderthalers, is that right? Because that's how he spells it.
It is,
okay.
Yep.
That always sounds weird to me. But Neanderthalers and Cro-Magnon existed side by side and waged relentless and savage warfare against each other. He then kind of digresses into this long paragraph that, goes into, starts talking about Abraham Lincoln. So we'll skip that one, right? How would you like a tale of the warfare between a Cro-Magnon, say one of the artists who painted the pictures of reindeer and mammoths, which still amaze the tourist, and one of those brutish ogres, perhaps over a girl who has taken a fancy of the Neanderthaler, And the Cro-Magnon artist follows the Neanderthaler man to his den, but we have no room to tell the story in the Eyrie. We wish one of our author friends would write it for us.
Right.
And that's exactly what he did.
That's how many people here have read Spear and Fang? All right, most people here. If you've read it, that is literally the plot, right? Here's the interesting thing. This was what month was this?
This was
November or December,
1924.
right? December,
So it
which
came out in
means
November.
it would have come out
Come
probably
November.
early November. We know from Post Oaks and Sandruff's, the Howard sort of quasi-fictional autobiography. In there, he talks about the fact that he'd had the story accepted, and he mentions a Thanksgiving football game where he's having a conversation about it. So
sometime before November 27th, he
Right.
got the heads up from
that means
Farnsworth Wright.
he had to submit the story. He read this,
Read it?
right? Had to crank
it.
out this story, get it off to Farnsworth Wright, have Farnsworth Wright accept it, all within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks.
2 or 3 weeks.
So one of the things, I was kind of looking at, why was he, obviously Howard's very prolific, he can crank stuff out, but I feel like one of the reasons why he was able to do this is because he kind of knew exactly what Farnsworth Wright was asking for, not just a caveman story with Cro-Magnon versus, a Neanderthal. Howard had also probably by this point started reading The Outline of History by H.G. Wells. And in there, it's a nonfiction book. It's one of Wells's a nonfiction sort of macro history, right? And in there's a section, and I feel like Wright must have been familiar with this idea as well, where he talks about Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal man. He talks about Neanderthal being a brutish ogre and being the origin of folk tales of ogres and giants, which Wright specifically uses here in this. But looking more into it, there was also a fictional story that H.G. Wells wrote a couple of years earlier based on this idea that was published in the Saturday Evening Post called The Grizzly Folk. And it was basically about a prehistoric war between Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals. Can't really prove it, but I suspect that Wells may have been an influence here, possibly both on Howard and Wright. So, Wright is asking for this concept of having, these two types of, early humans fighting each other. And Howard, probably reading this passage, had already had this in his mind, maybe from reading Wells, and instantly, he knew exactly what Wells was asking, or what Wright was asking for. Cranked this out, got it sent off. Rusky's chomping at the bit. Right.
Howard had already written some of the Tahan stuff by that point. So
That's
he
a good
was
point.
ready- He was ready.
He was ready, right? He had caveman fiction already, on his brain clearly, maybe already on his typewriter, ready to
Well,
submit.
in addition, he wrote exactly what Farnsworth Wright asked for.
Exactly.
How could Farnsworth Wright reject it?
Exactly.
So,
But even though he was going directly off what Wright asked for, it's still very much a Robert Howard story, and he put his own spin on it. In Spear and Fang, when he writes, both the girl and the youth were perfect specimens of the great Cro-Magnon race, which came from no man knows where and announced and enforced their supremacy over beasts and beastman.
Right.
That sounds like nothing on its face, but if you've read Howard's letters, and he's talking about the Cro-Magnon to his friends, that leads into the Hyborian age, very directly. He was talking about, okay, the Cro-Magnon people supposedly just appeared in Europe out of nowhere. Where did they come from? Well, I think they might have come from Atlantis. And it's one of those things where it's more obvious in hindsight, but this was a step in the development toward his later world building and heroes. Because this is very much going into what would become the Cull stories, which became the Conan stories. So even at this very early period during his writing, Robbie Howard is not necessarily thinking ahead, but he's laying the foundation for what he's going to build up to.
You're starting to get hints of this, and we know the source that this idea likely came from, the idea that Cro-Magnon man just sort of suddenly appeared in Europe, especially Western Europe. It was a Scottish mythologist named Lewis Spence, who wrote a book in 1923 called The Problem of Atlantis. And this was his sort of his hypothesis that he had the idea of sort of a Stone Age Atlantis. and that Cro-Magnon man probably came from this Stone Age Atlantean kingdom. When Atlantis sank, they came into Western Europe, the survivors. This is something I've done a lot of, it's a rabbit hole we could go way down. But this gives us the idea, and I know it was Rusty and Patrice that really kind of started fleshing this out early on. Why is it in the Kull stories that the Atlanteans are barbarians, right? And even when he describes them, they're almost less than barbarians, right? They're almost cavemen. That was an unusual idea at the time. Most people writing about Atlantis were writing about high civilizations and even highly advanced civilizations, if you look at what the Theosophists were doing. So it's an unusual idea, the idea of like a prehistoric Atlantis. And Spence was really the only person out there kind of pushing this idea. So we're pretty sure that's where Howard got that concept from too. So it's and it's actually an article I just was kind of working on, some of the stuff that you're talking about, Bobby. How this early caveman fiction is in a lot of ways a prototype or a foundation for what we would later call sword and sorcery. And you can really trace that beginnings here. You get with the Neanderthal, like what Will was reading there, an ogre, right? Spear and Fang on its face doesn't really have a weird element or supernatural element except for the Neanderthals themselves. They're treated thematically like monsters, right? So this is really like a hero fighting a monster story. What's interesting is you see much later in Rogues in the House, in the Conan story, when Conan is fighting Thak, right, who's often depicted as, you see him in art depicted as like a giant gorilla with a red cape, right, like it's Gorilla Grodd, from DC, right, but that's not really what Howard is describing. Howard's describing a hominid of some sort, right, and I've kind of put forward the hypothesis that Howard is actually talking about Thak as a Neanderthal, right, which seems weird to us because we see modern depictions of Neanderthals being very human-like. But that wasn't always the case in the 1920s. It wasn't the case in some of the books that Howard was reading, like Wells's Outline of History. Neanderthal was thought to be much more beast-like, and ape-like in those days. And when you read Spear and Fang and the fight between the caveman protagonist in Spear and Fang, and you read the fight between Conan and Thak, the fight itself is almost identical in the way it plays out and in the language that Howard uses to describe what's going on, describing Thak versus the Neanderthals years earlier. And so it's an interesting kind of thing. So, you can see, again, right here, his first published story, some of the great things he would do later, those seeds are already planted here.
Will, you look like you want to say something.
Well, I was just going to tag on at this point to change it so that when actually Howard got the notification from Farnsworth Wright that it had been accepted, he was living in a boarding house down in Brownwood with Lindsay Tyson. And Lindsay Tyson later recorded what he remembered when Howard got that letter. Again, remember, this is his first publication. This is the beginning of his publication career with Weird Tales and, period, with the pulps. And Lindsay Tyson, and I put all of this in the book because I thought this was really important, but he said, I was with Bob when he got a notice. Weird Tales magazine had accepted his story. He was about the happiest man that I have ever seen. And then he said something which I thought was kind of really interesting, especially knowing the biography of Robert E. Howard. Bob kneeled down by his bed and said, I am going to thank my God for this. He said a silent prayer. He remarked that after this, maybe I won't have so much trouble selling my writings.
Yeah, because he had already been submitting to more magazines than just Weird Tales, and he'd gotten nothing but rejections. Weird Tales was his first sale, and for a while it was his only market, especially during that long, lean 2 years where it's not that he wasn't writing, it's not that he wasn't submitting, but Weird Tales had gone through an ownership change, and they now had a glut of fiction. They had a lot of stories they bought from the old regime that they had to go through, and it took a long time. The Lost Race was what, 1926?
26, yeah.
Yeah. It took a long time for them, they'd accept it, and then maybe it wouldn't be published until the next year, and then the check wouldn't arrive until a couple months after that. So
Right.
He couldn't live off what he was making at the beginning.
Yeah, he did. He did get a few sales real quickly, though, right here in the very next issue, actually, I don't know if you've held that up yet. This is
the issue that Spear and Fang
right.
appeared in.
So this is the July 1925 issue. Unfortunately, it doesn't have an interior illustration, but
Buried
there
in
it
the
is.
back, no illustration.
Right, but there it is. First published sale 100 years ago. Right, that's pretty cool. In fact, it would have been on the newsstand in June. Since it's so it would have literally been to the month 100 years ago.
We also have an insight into how Howard felt. So in Post Oaks, which is a semi-autobiographical. So there's a lot of biographical in the very first 2/3, and then it goes off into fiction. But he's really writing about himself over about a 2-year period. So because there's been a lot of research that has demonstrated and even can specify exactly what those events were and when they occurred in Post Oaks, this, again, semi-fictional autobiography, I decided, and I'm the first one to do this in a biography, is to include those quotes from that in the biography, because it really reveals a lot of insights about Howard. And so when this came out, we don't really know exactly what his reaction was from any letters or anything that he wrote, but in Post Oaks he says, and what I do is I change the protagonist, which was Steve, I just change it in brackets to Bob. This was the pinnacle in Bob's life, Howard wrote in Post Oaks. He sat and stared at his name in print for hours at a time, thrilling to his fingertips. He could scarcely believe it, and at times feared that it was, after all, a gorgeous dream from which he would too soon awaken. So, again, and he got two subsequent acceptances right off the bat.
Right, the very next story. It's funny, you can see on the cover here, the one that made the cover story here, is a werewolf story, right, by H. Warner Munn. Howard's second professional sale in the very next issue was a werewolf story, The Forest of Villefort, which introduced the character of Demontour, sort of a French, adventurer, kind of a scoundrel type character, who ends up fighting with a werewolf, ends up becoming a werewolf at the end of the story himself. And then Howard wrote a sequel, which was accepted, and then published in the January 26 issue, is that right? February 26. February 26. A few months later, was published at the beginning of 1926, and that's Wolf's Head. How many people have heard of Wolf's Head, at least? Anyone, right?
He was off his noodle when he wrote that.
There's a very funny, I don't know if Bobby's got the notes on it, but there's a very funny letter where he describes Wolf's Head. But Wolf's Head is the sequel to Forest of Villefort. So now you have Demontour, who's already a werewolf. You find out that he has been traveling around for years trying to rid himself of this curse before he ends up in this fortress on the Portuguese fortress on the west coast of Africa, where it is just a bonkers story. It's pretty crazy. But
Lovecraft liked it.
Of course he did.
Lovecraft said, I first became conscious of him as a coming leader just a decade ago when, on a bench in Prospect Park, Brooklyn, I read Wolf's Head. I had read his 2 previous short tales with pleasure, but without especially noting the author. Now, in 26, I saw that Weird Tales had landed a new big-timer of the Clark Ashton Smith and E. Hoffman Price caliber, nor was I ever disappointed in the zestful and vigorous newcomer. And that was H.P. Lovecraft to E. Hoffman Price, 5 July 1936. That was part of his memoir of Howard after he passed. But the funny thing about Wolf's Head is it's a mess of a story, but you can directly see the parallels with the first Solomon Kane story.
Right, yeah.
You've got a villain that's a wolf. You have the trek to Africa.
Right.
You've got that whole shift in Mylou. But Solomon Kane's a much better story.
Right. You could tell it's an early story. It's kind of a mess. But what's significant about it, in my opinion, something that's often not remarked upon, this is Howard's first professionally published recurring character. Right, and he had written a lot of stories with recurring characters before that, the early El Barak stories, things like that. But this was the first time, like right off the bat, he's already, working on the, putting together a series with a character. It only lasts for 2 stories, right? But, he was already of a mindset to try and do that, and create this character. And I got to tell you, I feel like Dave Montour is a very underused, character, for, like some of the pastiches and stuff. There's lots of stories out, pastiche stories about Solomon Kane and Call. Man, Dave Montour, this is like Werewolf by Night, 50 years before Marvel, did something like this.
It's a great idea for somebody that writes for the comics.
I may have
Before Lon Chaney.
I may have already put a pitch out there. Right. Yeah. Go ahead. What'd you have, Bobby?
So when we talk about his first professional sale, Spear and Fang brought in $15, $16 according to one source, but yeah, it's about $15, which wasn't bad for the time. You got to remember, this was not quite the Great Depression, but it was back when you were lucky to make that in a week on a regular job. Okay? H.P. Lovecraft's rent in a Brooklyn apartment was $10 a week. All right? So how many stories do you have to write to make rent? And Howard wasn't doing
It's too early for math, Bobby.
All right. All right. My point is that he got the idea that he could get actual money for his writing. And he wanted to do that. He wanted to be a professional writer that wasn't supported by his parents. And you got to think about that when you're thinking about those 2 years when he was trying to sell stuff and he wasn't, and he had Weird Tales holding on to these stories and like, when are they going to print them? When are they going to print them? When am I going to get paid? And he just kept writing. That was his apprenticeship as a pulp writer, was rejection after rejection after rejection, waiting on the pulps to get back to him. Because you cannot make an editor talk to you until they're ready.
And he was still trying to break into the, the so-called, higher level pulps like Argosy and Adventure. He was always trying to get in there. He did eventually get a story in Argosy later, but often he would still have to fall back on Weird Tales, even when he would write something like the story that we know is Red Shadows. He called it Solomon Kane to start with. Was written originally. It was submitted, I believe, to Argosy, wasn't it, Rusty? As I recall. I think maybe one of them anyway.
I thought it was Adventure.
Maybe it was Adventure. It may have been Adventure.
I thought it was Adventure.
Right. So he was trying to break into those higher level genre pulp, multi-genre pulps, right? General fiction pulps. But he would always make sure he would include a supernatural or a weird element in there, because once he inevitably got rejected by Adventure, he could always turn around and send it to Farnsworth Wright and get it published in Weird Tales because he had some sort of weird element in it. That was kind of how and he developed as a writer. We think of him as someone who creates a lot of these genres, like sword and sorcery, like weird westerns, even weird boxing. Right, that one didn't really take off, but. It was because he was mixing genre elements sort of intentionally, because it gave him the ability to pitch it to different markets, his stories, right? So he was also thinking commercially there, but in the process ended up creating these, a lot of these hybrid, or at least popularizing a lot of these hybrid genres that we think of him, that he is known for today.
So to piggyback off what Rusty had said about Howard being off his noodle, so he had received the proof pages for Wolf's Head, and this is what he wrote in a letter to his friend Tevis Clyde Smith. After reading it, I'm not altogether sure I wasn't off my noodle when I wrote it. I sure mixed slavers, duelists, harlots, drunkards, maniacs, and cannibals.
Reckless.
What's that?
I sure mixed them all reckless.
Yeah. And he was so despondent over reading this, what he had written, which is kind of sad. He decided to write a satirical piece called Wolf's Dung. It also motivated him, unfortunately, to go back and find some jobs and start picking up, some odd jobs and things, which took time away from him being able to write. So the 2 years where he kind of had a slump was partly partly Wolf's Head fault.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Well,
partly,
so- Well, that's why he went to work at the drugstore.
right. And that drained him, and he couldn't write for the, year and a half that he was there. So he kind of was his own worst enemy sometimes, but I guess aren't we all?
Right. Because listen to that description. Who wouldn't want to read that? It's a glorious train wreck, of a
I want
story.
to read Wolf's Stomach. That's the one I want to read.
Right?
I'll take one of these and throw
Right.
it in.
Spear and Fang has a lot of interesting little connections. A lot of Howard's fiction dovetails with other stories that he would write, some of which got published, some of which didn't. So when you're looking at Spear and Fang as the story of these Stone Age people, that leads almost directly into The Lost Race, which is the Picts were, in Howard's early writing, the last of the Stone Age men. You know, these were the last Neolithic peoples that were being pushed out by the Celts with their weapons of bronze. And if you read, he did a incomplete novel, which was sort of a recollection of different incarnations of a character. The first one starts out with a tree man going up against a gorilla-like hairy man, and continues on from there up through the ages of history. And you get a lot of these little moments that are parallel. And you can see that Howard is working on these ideas and really polishing them. And the stuff you get in print is almost always the most polished pearls. But when you read his fragments and some of his letters and stuff where he's working on these ideas, it's very clear that all this stuff is still going through the back of his head. He just needs to work it out in writing before it's really ready for prime time.
Right. That little fragment that you talk about too, the language in there, a lot of it, you can really see the influence of Jack London's Before Adam.
Yeah.
In that one, it's got a lot of the, very similar names, and so it's cool seeing where he was getting ideas from, and especially in this early period, getting snippets here and there, but then turning them into his own thing.
Yeah, that's where you
Always,
get the
right?
James Allison tales.
Right. So, I realized we started this, we didn't actually even introduce ourselves. Or welcome everybody here to Howard Days in the first panel. Thanks for all of you guys for coming out. Why don't we introduce ourselves now that we've almost finished the panel?
Okay.
Bobby.
I'm Bobby Derie. I'm the author of Weird Taylor's essay on Robert Howard and others, among other things. If you've got a free book today, it was probably me handing it to you.
Right. Don't let him sell you. He's also the author of Sex and the Cthulhu Mythos. Don't let him, look, he's turning all red here. Don't let him see.
That's the
We know-
sunburn.
Right? No, I don't believe it. I'm Jeff Shanks. I'm an archaeologist, historian. I do a lot of work on Robert Howard's world building. I think that he does something I don't think he gets enough credit for. And as Bobby said, you can see it at the very beginning, the things that will grow into his greater fictional world. You see it with Spear and Fang, some of those seeds being planted early on. And Will's got a new book to plug.
Yeah. I'm Will Oliver. I'm a criminal justice professor at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas. My main area is policing, so that all prepared me really well to write a biography of Robert E. Howard. So this just came out in April, and so far it's gotten really good reviews, which I'm
It
very...
is truly excellent.
I got Rusty saying it, so we're done.
Rusty's glad because now he doesn't have to write it. That's all. But Will's going to be back at the pavilion selling copies of these. So make sure you come by there and pick one up. Get him to sign it for you. Cool. Okay.
Let's talk very briefly about the legacy of Spear and Fang. And there's two things I want to talk about. The first one is Manly Wade Wellman, who was a Weird Tales author that really came into his own during the 1940s and 50s under editor Dorothy McGilwraith. And McGilwraith worked with Wellman to develop series characters, but Wellman started out under Farnsworth Wright trying to sell him stories about this guy from Atlantis. And it didn't work because there was already a series about a guy from Atlantis called Call.
Right.
But Wellman sort of mined the same vein as Spear and Fang in his Hawk the Mighty stories. And Hawk the Mighty was a Cro-Magnon in what would be Europe, fighting against the harried men who were the Neanderthals which he later connected to the Shinokin in one of the early occult detective stories. But there's actually a story, Hawk Goes to Atlantis,
Right.
which there was a theory at the time of the Mediterranean was walled off from the sea. It was all grassland, sort of like Doggerland, how we think of it today. And then the Mediterranean came in and flooded it all. But that was Hawk going to Atlantis, was walking across the bottom of what we think of the Mediterranean Sea to this big city on a cliff. And that's a little bit out of continuity. But the other
No,
thing,
that's good. They just to throw it out there, I think it was Paizo actually reprinted all the Wellman's Hawk the Mighty stories a few years back in paperback. So it's out there in print, available
Yeah.
collection of them.
but the big thing was Primal, the animated series.
Right.
Who are the characters in it? Spear and Fang.
Yeah.
That was very much a thematic nod to Robert E. Howard. And it's a wonderful series if you've never seen it.
How many people have seen Primal? Tartakovsky's Primal on the was it on Hulu, I guess.
I watched it on Amazon
Or
Prime.
yeah, Max. Yeah, it's on Max originally, but it's available in several streaming platforms now.
When is that from?
I'm sorry.
When is it from?
It's out there now. In fact, the second season just dropped last year, I think, something like that. So highly recommend it. Tartakovsky's a huge Robert E. Howard fan, as Bobby said. And he's not hiding it, right? And it's a caveman fiction, but the main character is basically Conan with the serial numbers filed off, right? But done as a caveman. It's very clear Tartakovsky wanted to do Conan, but this is his way of getting around that and doing his version of the character, but as a caveman, doing that. By the second season, he basically drops all pretenses and just gives this caveman a sword, and all of a sudden now it's Conan. And that second season, now it's the Hyborian age with the serial numbers filed off.
With magic and monsters and
The whole 9 yards. I mean, it's very much, pastiche isn't the right word, right?
A
It's
love
certainly
letter.
it is a love poem. I like that. Yeah, So highly recommended. If you haven't seen Primal yet, go check it out. It's available on several streaming platforms. And yeah, Spear and Fang. 100 years later, people are still riffing off it. So. Cool. What else we got? If nothing else, we can shoot it out to the audience for some questions. What do you think?
yeah, we can do questions.
All right. Come on. There's one back there.
So, y'all were talking about the descriptions of Neanderthals being like ogres and stuff.
Right.
Earlier, there was Arthur Machen.
Yes.
Who wrote the Black Book.
Mhm.
I know that would go on to influence Howard's writing of the Black Stone.
Right.
Do you think Howard was at all influenced by that when he was writing Spear and Fang?
No.
No. The Mackin was being reprinted over here in the mid-20s.
Yeah.
We know he read, Novel of the Black Seal. We see those elements, and in fact, he references Novel of the Black Seal in one of them.
Children of the Night.
The Little People is sort of the first story that he, wasn't published in his lifetime, that you see these, Arthur Machen, very explicitly Arthur Machen elements in it. And that was, 27, I think, is when he wrote that, probably. So it's a little bit later. It would have been, I don't think he'd read Machen at that point, because I think it was 25 is when there was a whole series of Arthur Machen books that were being
But
reprinted
not reprints, yeah.
and being published in the States. So he would
In one
have,
of his letters, I think to Clyde Smith, mentions Machen in several stories.
yes.
Yeah.
And it would have been, it was probably right after this that he would have picked it up. It would have been right in that period there in the mid-20s, probably, right?
Well, he was telling Clyde about his correspondence with Lovecraft.
Right, which was later.
Which is
right.
1930.
Lovecraft mentioned Machen, the
Right.
writer of, and
Right.
stories.
The thing about Machen's Little People, and if anybody doesn't know what we're talking about, Arthur Machen was a British weird fiction writer and journalist who mostly did his influential fiction during the 1890s, but there was a Machen boom in the 20s where it was reprinted by Knopf in a series of hardcovers. And Machen had this idea that the stories of fairies and changelings and stuff were based on reality. That there was a small people that lived in the British Isles before everybody else got there, and they had stone tools and strange powers, and those were the origins of the fairies. And this is an idea called euhemerism, the idea that behind every legend and folk tale, there's some kernel of truth. And his folk horror, Machen, was really about, okay, you've got these strange happenings, you've got these strange legends, and it's real. There's something actually there. And it was a huge influence on Lovecraft. It was a big influence on Robert E. Howard, especially his early conception of the Picts. But what really happened in 1930s when he started talking with Lovecraft was they got together and they went a different way. Lovecraft diverted Howard's idea of what the little people were versus what Howard had been depicting the Picts as in his early stories that led into the Bran McMorn stuff. So in the beginning, in the earliest Pictish stories, they were this race of stunted giants.
Right. They were the characters that in the later stories would actually become the worms of the earth,
Yeah.
the children of the night. You know, he kind of worked it out. That idea, though, it goes back to a sort of it was an anthropological idea that was actually popular in the late 1800s, which is where Machen got it from. So there were legitimate, like, early anthropologists pushing this idea of a prehistoric pygmy race in Europe, you know, and people bought into it. Max Mueller, the famous mythologist and folklorist, he really liked it for a while. And another writer that was also influenced by this idea is J.R.R. Tolkien. One of Tolkien's professors at Oxford was one of the last anthropologists that was a holdout on that, this pygmy prehistoric race idea, and that's where we get hobbits from, right? So
And orcs.
and the orcs, right? So the sort of subterranean, people. So they were doing the same thing. But I love the idea that Tolkien takes this idea that Machen was using and that anthropologists were talking about, and he creates these cute little pudgy hobbits underground, subterranean. Howard hears about this idea, and they're devolved, evil little dwarf reptilian subterranean creatures, right? That more than anything else, to me, I think sometimes encapsulates that difference between Howard and Tolkien, right? The worms of Middle Earth. Right?
All right. Another question?
Yes, I have a question in relation to gold. I remember reading somewhere that Plato talked about how in Atlantis people would start off as morally superior, and as they went on, more quote-unquote civilized,
Right.
They would grow greedy and morally decay. Do you think this idea had any influence on Howard and how he approached coal and as a noble
That's an
barbarian?
interesting idea. Oh, that's a good one to unpack.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
If you look at
That's a good
how
question.
Atlantis was depicted, especially in the pages of Weird Tales early on, like Clark Ashton Smith shows a very decadent, magic-heavy, science-heavy Atlantis. This is Atlantis near the end of its arc of civilization, as Spencer would have it. Howard has it the other way around. He's depicting the early Atlantis, the Atlantis that is just emerging from absolute savagery. You don't actually see it much in the Cole stories themselves. There's more in the early fragments, but
Yeah, I think it is different. I mean, what Plato was doing there is playing on kind of an older Greek idea of of a golden age in the past, and then Hesiod is actually really kind of the first one that comes up, has that basic premise, right, where you begin with a golden age that then degenerates into a silver age and an age of heroes, and that mankind does degrade over time. And I think you're right. I think Howard, though, he was playing with these kinds of ideas. It's sort of the opposite of what was becoming popular in anthropology in the late 1800s. Coming after Darwinism, people started applying the theory of evolution to cultures, and it was they kind of had the opposite extreme. Cultures evolve over time, just like animals and humans do, right? And you start out at a level of, quote, savagery was the term that was used, and you evolve into barbarians, and you evolve into civilizations, right? So there was at the time, the exact opposite of the way the Greeks thought, right? That humans devolved over time. Instead, they evolved, right, to become more complex, more advanced, right? Howard, though, always, this is actually kind of some of the stuff that he argued with Lovecraft about, right? Howard, you see in all of his writings, what he does is he has civilizations and cultures, they rise up, they become more evolved, but then something happens and they crash back down and they become devolved again, and they could rise back up and back down again. The famous line where Howard talks about barbarism being the natural state of mankind, right? He's not saying that barbarism is a preferred state. What he's saying is that barbarism is that point of equilibrium in the middle between savagery down here and civilization up here, right? As cultures are moving up and down, they sort of, that point of barbarism in the middle is maybe the more natural state for humanity. So Howard was kind of toying with his own sort of version of this idea, not humans devolving over time necessarily or evolving, but doing all of those things, right? Both up and down over time, throughout history. That was way more than you probably wanted to know.
And it should probably be added, we don't know that Howard ever read.
Well, I would argue it this way, or I would answer you this way. When Plato was doing that, it was in the Dialogues Timaeus, and what he was doing was kind of setting up this perfect society as an analogy to talk about how that would function within that. The problem is that over time, people started to believe that Atlantis was real and that it sunken and gone away. And so that kept kind of coming up as people saying, well, Plato was referring to a real country that disappeared. Well, again, it developed into its own thing. And the interesting thing is, in America, so again, getting closer to home here, Ignatius L. Donnelly wrote a book in 1882 called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And I was amused when I found out he was actually a U.S. congressman.
He was, from Minnesota. Yeah.
But he was writing as if Atlantis was real. Mm-hmm. And so it caught the popular attention, and people started researching Atlantis as if it were real. You probably know more about this than I do.
I actually have a handwritten letter of Donnelly's. Yeah.
Oh, yeah? Cool.
Yeah, this is a rabbit hole I got way down. But yeah, so Donnelly really popularized that idea of Atlantis as a real place. If it weren't for Donnelly, we would not have had, it wasn't a direct influence, but we wouldn't have had Call of Atlantis probably if it hadn't been for Donnelly writing in 1882. Donnelly was inspired by Jules Verne, though. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where there's the famous scene, Atlantis had kind of fallen out of popular culture, by that point, until Jules Verne has this famous scene where the Nautilus, they find the subterranean ruins of Atlantis in that scene, and that inspired Donnelly to throw out the idea, Atlantis proponents today, like people like Graham Hancock and stuff like that, in a lot of ways, all they're doing is just regurgitating what Donnelly was saying in 1882, right? The idea of, hey, there's pyramids on this side of the Atlantic and pyramids on this side of the Atlantic, so they must have come from Atlantis, right? And this is the idea, what we call diffusionism in archaeology. But it set that stage, right? Right after that, you get the Theosophists playing on a more fantastic version of Atlantis, an advanced version of Atlantis, and Howard was influenced by theosophical writers. We mentioned Lewis Spence earlier coming up with this Stone Age Atlantis. In a lot of ways, what Lewis Spence was trying to do was push back against the theosophical or occult, more fantastic version of Atlantis, which had become popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and try to come up with something a little bit more realistic, right? It sounds crazy to us now, Cro-Magnon Atlanteans, right? But at the time, that was actually an attempt to that was really a response to the theosophical Atlantis with airships and crystals and things like that, right?
Right.
So, right,
Remember
and Vril.
Remember the Shadows depicts start out in what is now the Pacific Northwest,
That's right.
work their way down to South America, and then over to
And
Atlantis.
then over to Atlantis before going to the mainland. And they pushed the Atlanteans out, right? I could go into the whole Azilian thing, but I won't. Read some of my articles. Yes. Yeah. It's important though, because this is the milieu that we're talking about that Howard was drawing from. for these stories for sure.
Question over there?
You talked about Spear and Fang, you talked about the werewolf stories. What are some other Howard's early works that you think readers should pay attention to outside of the usual Cull, Conan, Owen Kane collections?
What do you think, Will? You're looking thoughtful over there.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I guess my reaction is like Spear and Fang is important because it was his first professional sale. But if you read it, it's like, I mean, there's little, hints in there of Howard's later writing, but, I mean, and again, I'm not a literary, I told you I was a cop, right? So, I just I read the story and I'm like, oh, I like that, or, and that's how I was with Spear and Fang.
The hyena, the dream snake.
Right.
These were both early African tales. Howard was trying that mode of fiction that is, how do I put this? Very H. Rider Haggard.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was trying to have, okay, you've got this white guy in Africa and something weird happens. And maybe it's indigenous magic, or maybe it's just the weirdness that is Africa. But you've got this guy out on the edge of things, out away from civilization, and something strange happens. And he's just trying to pursue that. And Howard didn't pursue that very long, but you can see elements of it still survive into the Solomon Kane series.
And the hyena, in a lot of ways too, it's a story about a weird hyena, right? So it's a lycanthropy story too. So it's building off of, he had the success and two sales of werewolf stories, right? So a lot of times you'll see Howard do this. He'll see something he was able to sell a story, and he'll take it out, okay, that worked, and he'll take an element from that and then put it into whatever the next story is that he's working on. The hyena I think is an example of that, bridging into that. And it's weird. I actually at one point was trying to find earlier tales of weird hyenas. I think it's like a staple in D&D now. It's one of the lycanthrope types in D&D. I really couldn't find many examples. Of weird hyenas. I'm sure he must have pulled it from somewhere. It might have just been a story and adventure or something like that. But there doesn't seem to be really much of an actual African tradition of weird hyenas or anything like that I've been able to find. So
I would probably add in the Forest of Villefort and Wolf's Head. And there's actually a reason I'm working on it. It's kind of slow going. But so far, every werewolf story that I have read that was published before Howard published those two stories in Weird Tales, every one of them, the werewolf tale, the man turns into a wolf, 4 legs, dog-like, right? But he has it where in the full moon he turns into a wolf man. And I have yet to find, I'm still reading through all of these old werewolf stories, etc., but I have not found that yet. So
that's interesting.
In many ways, the question is, did Howard actually create turning into a werewolf as we know it today, the wolf man?
Yeah, that's
I
interesting.
got to think about that one.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
good call. Damn it, Will. I don't need any more rabbit holes to go down. More questions. Yeah.
Were there a lot of instances, since he was rejected a lot early in his career, were there a lot of instances of him sort of repurposing material later? I know, isn't that kind of what Conan came from, rejected Cull story, right? So, are there any of these where clearly
some
he
earlier
rewrote this
ones.
later as
He repurposed ideas, he repurposed
Right.
characters and settings. He didn't cannibalize a lot of the early stories. Not like he would later on. When he redid By This Axe I Rule as the Phoenix on the Sword, the first Conan story, that was a cannibalization.
Right. I'll throw one out there, Men of the Shadows.
All right, yeah.
Men of the Shadows was an early Brand McMorton story that wasn't published at the time. But in that story, it's a Brand McMorton story, but mostly it's really just a Pictish shaman telling the history that Rusty was just alluding to earlier, right? This is the history of the races of mankind, and the Picts were the first race. And the Picts lived in what's now California, but then it was an island back in the pre-cataclysmic times. And then the Lemurians in the Pacific or the second race. And this is actually something I'm going to talk about this a little bit in my paper later in the Glenn Lord Symposium. Then the Atlanteans were the third race, and then the Celts were the fourth race. And he talks about people, the Picts migrate, into mainland America, and then to Atlantis, and then over South America, even, and then over to Europe, and then the Atlanteans get pushed into Europe. And he talks about Neanderthal beast men, right? He calls them beast men. Then there's great cataclysm that sinks Atlantis and Lemuria, and it raises up the continent of North America, so it's not islands anymore. This is the great cataclysm that is used later. This is the prototype for it. He wrote that story in late 25, early 26. This becomes the model for the Hyborian Age. What we see in the Hyborian Age essay, 7 years later, basically. That's the prototype for Howard's fictional prehistoric world, where you have Atlantis and Lemuria and the Pictish Isles. Then there's a great cataclysm, right, that creates a new world, and that becomes the world of Kull first, and then later with some tweaks, he plugs the Hyborian Age into it, and it becomes the Hyborian Age with the Conan stories. 100% in his head canon, right?
He did a couple different versions of Old Pictish Wizard tells the tale of the race.
Right.
And he elaborates a little more each time. I think he did 2 or 3 of those.
He did, and it's funny, Farnsworth Wright rejected it because basically it's just a bookend story where it's like, hey, here's Bran McMorn and the Pictish shaman and a Roman centurion, but the whole story is just this Pictish shaman narrating this history. And Farnsworth Wright called him out on it. He's like, this isn't really a story. This is just some kind of weird history thing that you're writing. A few years ago, I published something. We found, I think Patrice had him and sent him to me, these early drafts that are drafts of Men of the Shadows, and I was able to kind of piece them together. There were 2 or 3 little things where you can see him working it out, and it really is just this historical essay. It's like a prototype of the Hyborian Age essay, but written probably in late 25, early 26. And he wrote all of that, and then he wrote this Bran McMorn story and just plugged this history into it. He's like, I got to turn it into a story. So Farnsworth Wright was 100% right. He wrote this fictional history piece for himself first, and then tried to turn it into something of a story. But I think that's a great example of something from that early period that ultimately would become hugely important later on with Hyborian Age.
I think we got time for one more question.
Yeah, we got one more. There you go, Jay.
Yeah, you got Zachariah Sitchin with his Earth Chronicles.
Right.
Speaking upon, the Anunnaki gods coming to Earth, seeding mankind. I'd like to know is how was the very first one to play around with that idea when we look at the origins of Yakosha and the Tower of the Earth?
Sort of, right? And I've talked about this a little bit. Sitchin, of course, was coming right after Eric von Daniken, right? Chariots of the Gods. What he's talking about is the ancient astronaut hypothesis, right? That became really popular in the 70s, with writers like this. But it has been around for a long time. You get some earlier sort of prototypes of that with Theosophy, and there was a sort of a Bible that was supposedly channeled by angels and later Oaspe, where you have angels flying in like light ships and stuff, which is almost a prototype of flying saucers. But in fiction, Yakosha is probably one of the first where it's truly sort of an alien. You have an alien that comes to Earth, is mistaken for a god, right? Because Yakosha, everyone's familiar with Tower of the Elephant, presumably, right? And Yakosha, right, this elephant-headed, alien creature who is almost certainly the Yakosha Ganesha, right? The Hindu god Ganesha, and Yakosha is worshipped in the East as a god, even in the story, right? And this is another example of euhemerism, like Bobby was talking about earlier, the idea that there was something real in the past and it gets, turns into mythology or religion, right?
And Howard might have been inspired by Lovecraft's use.
Right. So Call of Cthulhu had come out a few years before, right? And so you have Cthulhu, this like ancient extra-dimensional entity, right? But not necessarily like an alien in the sense that we think of an extraplanetary alien. He was more of an extra-dimensional entity. Howard was 100% like influenced by Call of Cthulhu. He loved that story and he talks about it, right? But Yakosha would be probably the first two where you get the idea that he is actually worshipped as a god, where he ties it into a modern religion or mythology. Stanley Weinbaum was an early science fiction writer that's kind of forgotten today, but was hugely popular in his time. He wrote a story in, I think it was in Astonishing, I can't remember if it was in Astonishing or Astounding, right after, like the following year after Tower of the Elephant, where it's called A Martian Odyssey. And in the sequel to it, the astronauts travel to Mars and they see these bird-like aliens with long, beaks and stuff like that. In the sequel to it, it was written a few months later, we find out that some of these Martians had come to Earth thousands of years before, and they were, it was the inspiration for the Egyptian god Thoth. Right, so right in that same period, within a couple of years, you had Howard doing this with Yakosha, you had Weinbaum doing it. Lovecraft had already written At the Mountains of Madness, but it wasn't published until 1936, a few years later.
C.L. Moore did Chamblou, which was
Chamblou,
Medusa.
that's right, Chamblou Medusa, right, and that was 33. That was 33. So it was kind of something that was in the zeitgeist probably, right? A lot of these writers were thinking about these ideas, so.
And they got adopted by all the pseudoscience and occultists and
right.
developed from there.
It's hard to say that he was the first, because it's kind of a gradient that evolved into that idea. But
I think that's all the time we got. I
think that's it.
It's 11:59.
It's 11:59. So everybody, we can go back to the pavilion, get some lunch, buy one of Will's books, and we will see you back here in a little bit. Thanks, everyone.